The scriptures tell us that Adam and Eve brought forth additional sons and daughters into the world, yet the text falls utterly quiet about the identities of these women. This silence is no mere oversight. Writings from antiquity that were left out of the biblical canon speak of names like Akla, Jumala, and still others. Their narratives contain tales of love deemed forbidden, conflicts between siblings that resulted in killing, and matrimonial unions that modern society would view as deeply problematic. Here's what makes this truly remarkable, though. These women became the forebears of whole societies, and the tales surrounding them shed light on puzzles concerning humanity's earliest days that organized religion has chosen to ignore for generations upon generations. Before we get started, though, if this is your first time here, think about clicking that like button and hitting subscribe if you haven't done so yet. When you support us, it allows us to keep making content like this, to help you discover something interesting or simply enjoy your time. And hey, drop a comment letting us know your location and what time it's showing on your clock right now. We're creating a worldwide community in this space, giving you the chance to find and interact with others who think like you do, right there in the comments below. So now, let's gently move into the narrative we're exploring today, all right? Opening thoughts and silences that were forbidden. At the very start, certain names never found their way onto the written page. Stories that evaporated before those who recorded history could preserve them. Earth's original family included daughters, whose words reach us only as faint murmurs, whose forms emerge only within the darkness thrown by their well-known brothers. The book of Genesis speaks to us of Adam and Eve, of Cain and Abel, of Seth, who came to take the place of the son who was lost. However, moving among these familiar characters are additional presences. Daughters who brought children into the world, who experienced love and suffered loss, who witnessed the planet's earliest dawn and experienced the very first broken heart. They lived as flesh and blood beings, and yet their identities disappeared like fog at sunrise. Texts from ancient times communicate through symbolic language. Where family trees track ancestry through male parents and their sons, they manufacture intentional quiet surrounding the women who enabled those bloodlines to exist. This quiet holds significance beyond simple exclusion. It exposes the deliberate construction of collective memory. Certain individuals made choices about which narratives warranted safekeeping and which should dissolve into nothing. The ancient Hebrew term for offspring in Genesis's early passages includes both male and female children. And yet, those who translated often presented it as referring only to sons, building a masculine resonance where voices of both genders once existed. This linguistic decision influenced hundreds of years of interpretation. Those who read learned to envision a reality filled mostly with men, with women showing up only when their presence became absolutely required for the narrative to move forward. Evidence unearthed by archaeologists from the ancient Near Eastern region shows us societies where women occupied substantial positions as religious leaders, business operators, and governing figures. Creation stories from Mesopotamia include mighty goddesses standing beside their male equivalents. The legal code attributed to Hammurabi deals with women's rights under law in considerable detail. These civilizations grasped that bringing things into being demanded both male and female energies operating in balance. The book of Genesis came forth from this abundant cultural background. Those who wrote it were familiar with narratives where daughters exercised power, where mothers determined fate, where feminine understanding provided direction for entire peoples. Something changed in the way the story got told, however. The daughters belonging to the first family turned into figures in the background, their experiences condensed into the gaps separating one verse from another. Traditions preserved by rabbis hold fragments of their remembrance. The Talmud makes reference to daughters delivered to Adam and Eve without providing details. Commentaries from the medieval period suggest their marriages and children. Sources from Islamic tradition offer names and character traits. These dispersed mentions point to what was once an abundant oral tradition that slowly disappeared as written documents acquired dominance. This pattern of leaving things out follows a consistent design. Across ancient written works, stories about women frequently survive only where they cross paths with narratives about men. Women who ruled as queens surface when they enter into marriage with kings. Mothers come into view when they give birth to heroes. Daughters appear when they wed sons of other men of prominence. Narratives centered on women standing alone remain uncommon, secrets guarded with care and handed down through lines of women who held on to what official records decided to erase. Those of us reading today have inherited this selective remembering. Lessons taught in Sunday school instruct young people about Cain's envy and Seth's moral character, while barely touching on the sisters who saw these events happen firsthand. Students at seminary commit to memory genealogies, tracking family lines through fathers while the connections through mothers stay unexplored. This builds a spiritual terrain occupied primarily by men, where wisdom associated with women shows up only now and then, like far-off lightning on an evening in summer. The Quiet tells us enormous amounts about how power was structured in societies of the ancient world. Those who wrote, usually men, put down what their cultures considered important. The experiences of women, viewed as tangential to the central story of how the divine interacted with people, received very little recording. Their interior experiences, their connections with God, their additions to early human civilization, these largely remain without chronicle. Still, there are traces that persist. Languages from antiquity keep feminine versions of words that hint at women taking active parts in religious and community affairs. Discoveries made by archaeologists bring to light figurines of goddesses and imagery connected to feminine worship from the time periods when these writings came into being. Artwork from caves and early human expression shows women in roles of leadership and spiritual importance. The daughters born to Adam and Eve stand for more than absent names in a family tree. They represent the innumerable women whose experiences have been absorbed into the stories of fathers, husbands, and sons. The silence surrounding them calls us to picture what exists beyond what was written, to catch sounds of voices never captured by those who recorded, to give respect to lives never acknowledged by official chronicles. Religious writings often work as condensed collections holding great multitudes inside their compact passages. The handful of words given to early daughters probably stand for vast oral traditions that once thrived in gatherings where women came together to exchange stories, where older women transferred memories to younger ones, where understanding associated with women moved through time like waterways beneath the ground. What we face becomes a matter of excavation. How do we uncover stories from within silence? How do we rebuild voices starting from their echoes? The work demands close focus on hints within language, awareness of cultural setting, and study of myths across cultures. It calls for honoring both historical precision and imaginative rebuilding. Those who told stories in ancient times understood that certain truths go beyond literal facts. They saw that narratives carrying mythic weight could communicate deep understanding about what it means to be human, about divine intention, and about the ordering of existence. The daughters of the original family, whether they existed as actual historical people or were built as symbols, stand for fundamental parts of what women experience that deserve to be recognized and investigated. Their stories sit waiting in the empty spaces separating words, in the quiet moments between verses, in the purposeful silences that gave official memory its shape. They call us to listen with greater care, to interpret with more imagination, to respect the complexity of human reality that ancient writings could only partly convey. The path into their world demands both careful scholarship and imaginative compassion. We need to hold respect for ancient materials while recognizing where they fall short, giving honor to what got preserved while admitting what got lost. When we do this, we start to catch voices that have been waiting for centuries for someone willing to hear. Flesh of her flesh, the earliest births. The very first cry heard anywhere on earth emerged from a daughter. Before sons discovered how to wail, before brothers learned about rivalry, a female voice declared humanity's arrival into the territory lying outside Eden. Eve, whose identity means living, turned into the mother of everyone who draws breath, and the child she delivered first pushed open the entrance to an existence of a different kind. Traditions surrounding ancient midwifery indicate that daughters usually come with reduced difficulty compared to sons. Their more compact build, their quicker development inside the womb, their inherent readiness for the birthing experience they themselves would someday go through. If this pattern held for the very first birth, Eve's initial labor could have been more gentle than one might expect. a kindness offered during humanity's first meeting with the suffering that comes with mortality. The text, written in Hebrew within Genesis, captures Eve's response to her first delivery with striking precision. "I have obtained a man with the Lord's assistance," she proclaims. Yet the word rendered as man holds uncertainty in the ancient Hebrew tongue. It can point to any person, irrespective of their sex. Certain scholars propose that Eve's statement honored the coming of humanity in general, not male humanity specifically. Stories of creation from Mesopotamia consistently present first births, bringing forth both male and female children at the same time. The Babylonian Enuma Elish portrays creation as a continuous activity, where male and female forces bring forth new life without ceasing. These related stories suggest those listening in ancient times anticipated the original family to contain daughters right from the start. Tradition preserved in the Talmud holds an interesting detail. Based on commentary from rabbis, every birth in the original family yielded twins, one male and one female. This doubling guaranteed humanity's survival while sidestepping the theological puzzles of where Cain and Seth discovered their brides. The daughters, even without names in Genesis, filled crucial positions in filling the early earth. Eve's mental condition throughout these initial births escapes simple understanding. She possessed no mother to lead her through the pain of labor, no grandmother to offer understanding about bringing children forth, no gathering of women to provide support and comfort. She confronted this fundamental experience completely by herself, with nothing but Adam's confused companionship and whatever divine direction might have been accessible. The suffering of childbirth, as Genesis tells it, formed a portion of the divine consequence for breaking the rules in Eden. This consequence held within itself, however, the beginnings of restoration. By means of the very experience that caused women to recall their fallen condition, they took part in creation's continuing work. Every birth stood for both penalty and blessing, judgment and grace twisted together. Proof uncovered by archaeologists from locations in the ancient Near East shows complex knowledge of childbirth and practices related to helping women deliver babies. Tablets made of clay hold thorough directions for handling labors that presented difficulties, formulas for easing pain, and appeals to goddesses who watched over women throughout delivery. These practices hint that even in humanity's most ancient days, birth was grasped as both a process occurring naturally and a spiritual enigma. The initial daughter delivered to human parents held distinctive meaning. She stood for the continuation of understanding associated with women, the keeping of whatever insights Eve had obtained while in Eden. Through this daughter, the experiences of paradise and banishment would transfer to coming generations of women, building a continuous chain of feminine remembrance reaching from the first garden straight to our current time. Think about the instant when this first daughter opened her eyes and looked at her mother's face. The understanding that moved between them went beyond normal bonding between parent and child. Here stood the second woman to exist, encountering the first. The responsibility of feminine experience was being transferred, though neither could entirely grasp how heavy that instant would prove to be. The delivery process itself must have been transformative. Adam and Eve had watched animals giving birth while in Eden. Human birth holds different weight, however. The lengthy duration of human pregnancy, the intricacy of human awareness forming in the womb, the extreme vulnerability of human babies, all these elements turned human birth into an event unlike any other in creation. Writings not included in Scripture suggest the earliest daughters came into the world with abilities developed beyond normal expectations. Certain traditions claim they managed to walk within hours of being born, communicate in words within days, and show wisdom exceeding their visible age. These abilities beyond nature identify them as beings in transition, still bearing marks of the divine likeness while adjusting to existence as mortals. The giving of names to these initial daughters opens intriguing questions. If Adam provided names for the animals in Eden, showing his dominance over what had been created, who gave names to the daughters? Did Eve assert this right for herself, declaring maternal authority over her female children? Or did the activity turn collaborative, with both parents taking part in the sacred work of naming? Practices of naming in ancient times often mirrored wishes for what would come or recognition of current situations. The first daughter's name could have communicated Eve's happiness at a successful delivery, her wish for humanity to continue, or her awareness of the special position this child would occupy in the world's developing narrative. The connection between the initial daughter and her mother must have been unlike any other throughout human chronicles. Eve possessed no pattern for being a mother, no cultural requirements to meet, no established ways of doing things to follow. She and her daughter needed to build the mother-daughter connection starting from nothing, setting up patterns that would shape all generations to follow. This first daughter confronted distinctive difficulties as well. She had no older women to look to as examples, no established culture of femininity to become part of, no handed-down knowledge to receive. Like her mother, she needed to construct womanhood, starting from the beginning, creating what it meant to exist as female in a reality where the very idea was still forming. The symbolic meaning goes deeper than individual experience. The first daughter stood for the principle of feminine understanding, establishing roots in earthly reality. Through her, the abstract idea of womanhood turned into solid fact. Her birth identified the moment when feminine experience started its path through time, bringing forward insights that would turn out to be crucial for human survival and prosperity. The Book of Jubilees and the Wives Who Were Sisters. Concealed inside libraries from antiquity, written in tongues most people of faith never studied, sit texts that keep what official scriptures decided to erase. The Book of Jubilees, referred to sometimes as the Lesser Genesis, came out of Jewish groups in the 2nd century before Christ. This writing dared to put names to the daughters left nameless, to put faces on the shadows, to give respect to women who had waited centuries for acknowledgement. Awan shows up first in Jubilees, described as Cain's sister born at the same time and his wife in the end. Her name comes from Hebrew origins meaning desire or yearning. The writing presents her not as simply a device to resolve problems in the family tree, but as a woman possessing her own character, aspirations, and challenges. She observes her brother's increasing fury, attempts to serve as mediator between Cain and Abel, and in the end carries the burden of becoming wife to a man bearing divine condemnation. Azura comes next, identified as Seth's twin and his intended spouse. Her name translates to blessed or aided by God, pointing to her position in building the righteous family line that would, in time, bring forth Noah. Jubilees shows her as tender and perceptive, holding an instinctive grasp of divine intention that balances Seth's more direct righteousness. The writing brings in additional daughters whose names echo across rabbinical writings like bells heard from a distance. Lulua, whose name means pearl or thing of value. Cliath, translating to shame or disgrace, possibly showing the complicated feelings around marriage between siblings in thinking that came later among Jews. Every name holds theological importance, indicating ancient writers grasped these women as more than requirements for keeping genealogies straight. Jubilees confronts the difficult reality of early human reproduction with striking candor. In a world holding only a single family, marriage joining siblings turns into not simply allowable but crucial for the species to survive. The writing frames these unions as portions of divine planning rather than human settlement, proposing God had intended from the start for the earliest generations to marry inside their direct family. The theological consequences spread outward. If God ordered humanity to be productive and increase while offering only siblings as possible mates, then marriage between siblings in the first generations held divine approval. Prohibitions that came later against such partnerships applied to changed situations when the human population had expanded enough to allow marriages outside the family. Commentators from ancient Jewish communities wrestled with this contradiction. How could behaviors later made forbidden by the law of Moses be required and blessed in earlier times? Jubilees settles the conflict by proposing different eras functioned under different divine arrangements. What became necessary for humanity's survival in one generation turned prohibited once that survival became secure. The daughters portrayed in Jubilees hold separate personalities that come through by means of short but telling details. Awan shows faithfulness to family regardless of personal price. Azura displays understanding beyond her years in selecting partners and bringing up children. Lulua exhibits creativity in household skills and advances in farming. These portrayals suggest the writer pulled from abundant oral traditions that kept memories of early feminine guidance. The marriages themselves get thoughtful treatment in Jubilees. Rather than hurried requirements, they develop as carefully considered choices involving both partners and their parents. Adam and Eve offer guidance to their children regarding compatibility, mutual regard, and the sacred character of joining together. The daughters take active roles in selecting their partners, showing self-direction uncommon in ancient marriage arrangements. Cultural background deepens our grasp of these stories. Societies in the ancient Near East engaged in different versions of marriage between close relatives, especially among families of royalty, attempting to keep bloodline purity intact. Egyptian pharaohs took sisters as wives, rulers in Mesopotamia married nieces, and Persian nobility showed preference for marriages between cousins. Jubilees shows awareness of these customs while arguing for their temporary necessity in humanity's most ancient days. The writing addresses practical worries about genetic health in marriages between close kin as well. Ancient writers lacked current knowledge of genetics but noticed that ongoing intermarriage inside families could create difficulties. Jubilees proposes divine protection guarded the earliest generations from such troubles, permitting healthy children despite close blood connections. Discoveries made by archaeologists from Qumran and additional locations have shown how earnestly ancient Jewish groups regarded these supplementary writings. The Book of Jubilees emerges among the works most often copied discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, indicating it held status as authoritative for numerous believers. Communities keeping these texts grasped them as crucial additions to scriptural canon. When Jubilees was written becomes vital for grasping its historical worth. Put together during the Second Temple era, it shows worries and questions that had built up across centuries of biblical interpretation. Those reading in ancient times struggled with the identical puzzles about genealogy that confuse modern readers. Where did Cain's spouse come from? How did humanity branch out from a lone family? Jubilees offered responses that addressed both theological and practical worries. The writing's handling of women shows forward-thinking elements alongside traditional beliefs. While the daughters in the end serve purposes related to reproduction, they receive personalities, choices, and spiritual understanding. They take part in family choices, provide guidance to their husbands, and show wisdom influencing their children's growth. Scholars today argue whether Jubilees keeps genuine ancient traditions or stands for imaginative theological thinking. Proof indicates both components have roles. Certain details concerning early human culture line up with archaeological understanding about societies in the ancient Near East. Additional components clearly show later theological worries projected backward onto history from the beginning. The book's impact reached well beyond its initial Jewish readers. Writers from early Christianity quoted Jubilees widely, handling it as authoritative scripture. Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity continues to place Jubilees within its biblical collection. Islamic traditions keep related stories concerning Adam's daughters, pointing to shared sources or wide-ranging influence across cultures. Reading Jubilees in our time calls for holding respect for ancient understanding while staying aware of historical limits. The writing keeps valuable understanding about how early groups grasped family organization, divine intention, and human connections. It gives respect to women who had been erased while confronting genuine theological riddles about human beginnings. The name daughters in Jubilees stand for more than individual people. They give form to the principle that women take active part in the history of salvation from its very start. Their stories indicate feminine understanding, guidance from mothers, and partnership in marriage have always been crucial components in God's connection with humanity. The sons we remember, the daughters we've lost. 3 names resonate through religious memory with such recognition they appear carved into rock. Cain, the furious brother whose offering proved unacceptable. Abel, the righteous keeper of flocks whose blood called out from the earth. Seth, the one who came as replacement and brought forward humanity's hope. And yet, standing beside each famous son were sisters without names whose stories stay trapped in silence. The narrative told traditionally centers on conflict among brothers, building a masculine conflict where jealousy results in violence and replacement. This focus hides a deeper truth, however. In families where the order of birth holds weight, where divine approval appears distributed without reason, where death shows up suddenly and without sense, The sisters carried witness to trauma that would influence all generations to come. Picture the sister who observed Cain's offerings producing weak smoke while Abel's burned bright and pure. She noticed the transformation in her oldest brother's expression, the way his shoulders grew tense and his hands formed fists. She could have attempted to comfort him, proposing better offerings for next time, not grasping that divine rejection had already determined his fate. Her attempts at creating peace would have been sincere, yet sadly without effect. Traditions from antiquity propose the initial conflict among brothers focused not on offerings from farming versus keeping flocks, but on arrangements for marriage. Following these sources, each brother came into the world with a twin sister meant to turn into his wife. The disagreement emerged when both brothers wanted the same woman, either due to her being especially beautiful or because the initial matching had somehow been thrown off. This different explanation places the sisters as figures at the center, rather than watchers on the edges. Their preferences, their beauty, their characters directly shape the first human catastrophe. The woman without a name, at the heart of brotherly competition, becomes the initial example of how masculine struggle for feminine attention can tear apart family harmony. Think about the psychological weight borne by the sister who lived past Abel's death. Whether she was his intended bride or simply his cherished sibling, she existed with the awareness that her being there could have played a part in the conflict that took his life. Counseling for grief in ancient times did not exist. She needed to work through trauma without therapeutic help, building patterns of mourning and healing that would shape all generations coming after. The sister connected with Seth confronted different obstacles. Delivered after tragedy had already hit the family, she matured in the shadow cast by a brother explicitly selected to take the lost son's place. Her identity took shape from absence, from the burden of family hope sitting on her brother's shoulders, from the requirement to help bring back happiness to parents who had gone through unthinkable loss. Legal codes from Mesopotamia during this time period offer understanding into how ancient families managed inheritance and marriage arrangements when children passed away young or turned down arranged partnerships. Property and marriage agreements could shift between siblings, indicating the sisters could have received not only land and animals, but also the marriage contracts initially meant for their brothers who had died or left. The daughters remaining after Cain's banishment confronted specific obstacles. Their brother had received God's mark, received a sentence to wander, yet was shielded from revenge. Did they keep contact with him? Did they know concerning the city he constructed, the descendants he brought forth? Ancient writings hint that family connections continued regardless of divine judgment, indicating the sisters could have functioned as secret links for communication between family members who had been separated. The psychological portraits of these early daughters come forth from attentive reading of patterns in genealogies. The sister linked with Cain's family line brought forth descendants who gained skill in working metal, making music, and managing animals. These advances indicate she held creativity and intelligence that she transferred to her children, adding to early technological and cultural advancement. Seth's sister, in the meantime, seems linked to the family line that started to call on the Lord's name. This spiritual awakening indicates her impact in setting up formal practices of worship, in building rituals that assisted her descendants in keeping connection with the divine regardless of their banishment from Eden. The quiet presence of daughters in these stories shows broader patterns across ancient writings. Women frequently show up as forces that set masculine action in motion without getting acknowledgement for their own agency. They spark conflicts, make solutions possible, and shape results while staying unnamed in official records. Their power functions through connections rather than action taken directly. Proof uncovered by archaeologists from early societies based on farming shows that women filled vital positions in creating techniques for farming, ways to preserve food, and practices for managing livestock. The abilities connected to early human civilization, weaving, making pottery, brewing, cultivating herbs, customarily belonged within areas of feminine authority. The daughters, without names, probably added significantly to humanity's advancement in technology. Religious traditions that formed around these narratives keep scattered details concerning the daughters' lives in later years. Some turned into mothers of important family lines. Others functioned as priestesses or wise women in their groups. A handful reached legendary standing as inventors or teachers. These fragmentary memories point to their initial importance, reaching well beyond their positions in conflicts between brothers. The pattern of giving names to sons while leaving daughters without identity shows ancient legal and social arrangements where masculine family lines bore property and standing, while feminine identity merged into the identity of husband or father. This pattern created chances, however, for women to shape events without drawing the notice that could have limited their actions. Those of us reading today have inherited beliefs about gender positions that might not have applied in humanity's most ancient days. Prior to set social arrangements, prior to rigid cultural requirements, the first daughters could have used authority and independence that later generations would consider surprising. Their silence in writings could show editorial choices made later rather than powerlessness at the time. The brothers we hold in memory influenced history by means of actions filled with drama, conflict, death, replacement. The sisters we've erased could have influenced it by means of gentler yet equally important additions, mending wounds in the family, keeping traditions alive, instructing children, keeping connections that permitted civilization to advance regardless of early trauma. Their narratives sit waiting in genealogies that reference wives without providing their names, in traditions that mention daughters without portraying them, in the empty spaces separating verses where feminine understanding functioned quietly yet with effectiveness. Bringing back their voices demands close focus on what ancient writings assume rather than what they say outright. Ancient understanding of the cosmos and divine ancestry. Past the recognized boundaries of Hebrew scripture sits a wide terrain of creation narratives where first women exercised power that resonated through ages. These ancient stories show patterns that assist us in grasping what could have been, what might have been, and what the daughters born to Adam and Eve stood for inside the cosmic arrangement that comes before written memory. Creation stories from Mesopotamia tell of Tiamat, the goddess from the beginning whose physical form turned into the basic substance for earth and sky. When she joined with Apsu, the deity of fresh water, their union brought forth the initial generation of divine beings. This coupling of feminine chaos waters with masculine order waters indicates ancient peoples grasped creation as fundamentally needing both masculine and feminine principles functioning together. Egyptian understanding of the cosmos presents Nut, the goddess of the sky whose body covered with stars curved over the earth each night. Her daily pattern of consuming and bringing forth again the sun showed how feminine divinity could hold both destruction and rebirth. The daughters of the original family could have received echoes of this cosmic feminine power, bearing within themselves the capacity to finish old patterns and bring forth new options. Greek stories of creation portray Gaia, the mother of earth who came forth from chaos at the beginning and brought forth the Titans, the first generation of divine beings who would, in time, govern the cosmos. Her descendants included both masculine and feminine deities who ruled natural powers, indicating ancient audiences anticipated first-generation divine families to contain powerful daughters alongside celebrated sons. Hindu traditions keep stories of Aditi, the mother of the gods, whose identity means without bounds or unlimited. She stands for the divine feminine principle that existed prior to creation starting, the source from which all additional deities came forth. Her daughters, the Devas, turned into goddesses who ruled different parts of natural and spiritual existence, showing how first-generation feminine divinities set up lasting influence. Norse stories tell of the first woman made from an ash tree by the gods Odin, Vili, and Ve. This creation was preceded, however, by the coming forth of Ymir, the giant from the beginning, from the interaction between ice and fire. The feminine principle shows up across Norse creation stories not as something added later, but as a central part of cosmic balance. These related traditions indicate something deep about ancient understanding of first families across cultures divided by enormous distances and centuries. Creation narratives consistently include powerful first women who fill crucial positions in setting up cosmic arrangement. The quiet around Adam and Eve's daughters turns more confusing when placed against this worldwide pattern of early feminine importance. Celtic stories speak of the Morrigan, triple goddesses of war, fate, and death, who influenced the destiny of heroes and peoples. Brigid ruled poetry, healing, and working metal, showing how feminine divinity covered both creative and destructive powers. These traditions indicate the daughters of the original family could have received similar dual parts of nurturing and fierce guarding. Observations of stars in ancient times show how tightly early peoples linked feminine divinity with cycles in the heavens. Venus, visible as both morning and evening star, became connected with goddesses across numerous cultures. The moon's phases offered natural calendars that ruled activities in farming and religion. The daughters of Adam and Eve, existing closest to creation's start, could have kept special consciousness of these cosmic rhythms. Proof uncovered by archaeologists from Neolithic locations shows widespread worship of goddesses during the time periods when societies based on farming first formed. Female figurines greatly outnumber male representations in early settlements, indicating feminine divinity held first importance in humanity's shift from hunting and gathering to farming and taming animals. The theological meaning reaches deep into questions concerning divine character itself. If God made humanity in his likeness, male and female he made them, then the first daughters bore divine resemblance equally with their brothers. Ancient creation stories consistently acknowledge this equality, indicating the Hebrew narrative's focus on masculine family lines stands for cultural addition that came later rather than initial understanding. Studies comparing religions show how monotheistic traditions frequently absorbed and changed earlier polytheistic components. The powerful goddesses of ancient collections of deities turned into angels, saints, or symbolic characters inside Jewish, Christian, and Islamic structures. The daughters of Adam and Eve could stand for transitional characters bearing goddess-like qualities inside monotheistic setting. Analysis of language in ancient creation writings shows subtle yet important patterns. Words portraying divine creativity frequently bear feminine grammatical gender, even when applied to masculine deities. Hebrew ruach, meaning spirit, is feminine. Greek sophia, meaning wisdom, is feminine. These linguistic selections indicate ancient writers grasped creative power as fundamentally feminine, even when given to male gods. The idea of divine ancestry takes on fresh meaning when viewed through this lens of comparison. Rather than simple biological reproduction, the first families stood for the crossing point of divine and human realms. The daughters functioned as bridges between celestial and earthly existence, carrying forward divine qualities while adjusting to mortal situations. Ancient mystery religions frequently included divine marriages joining sky gods and earth goddesses, unions that brought forth first generations of divine human hybrids. These traditions indicate the marriages joining Adam's sons and daughters held cosmic meaning past mere biological requirement, standing for the continuing creative partnership joining masculine and feminine divine principles. The dispersed references to early daughters in writings not in scripture start to hold more sense inside this wider setting. Rather than additions made later or solutions to problems in genealogy, they emerge as representatives of ancient understanding about feminine divinity's crucial position in creation and continuing cosmic upkeep. Discoveries made by archaeologists in modern times keep showing proof of complex goddess worship in ancient Near Eastern cultures, existing at the same time as early Hebrew traditions. Temple structures dedicated to Asherah, Astarte, and additional feminine deities indicate these religious practices shaped the cultural setting inside which Genesis took form. The daughters of Adam and Eve, grasped inside this abundant framework of comparison, come forth as possible bearers of divine wisdom traditions that came before patriarchal religious arrangements. Their silence in texts considered canonical could show theological decisions made later rather than initial lack of importance. Lilith, the shadow woman prior to Eve. Before Eve drew breath in Eden's garden, before Adam experienced the isolation that would result in humanity's first marriage, a different woman moved among the trees. Traditions from antiquity speak her identity with a combination of interest and dread. Lilith, the first spouse who turned down submission, whose rebellion threw shadows that would land across every daughter delivered to Adam's line. The most ancient references to Lilith show up in writings from Mesopotamia, portraying demons of the night who posed threats to women carrying children and infants just born. These beings from beyond nature held feminine shapes yet exercised powers that went beyond human limits. They possessed the ability to travel through darkness, tempt men while sleeping, and take children from their mother's embrace. Beneath the demonic pictures, however, sat hints of a story running deeper concerning divine feminine power that had somehow turned wrong. Jewish traditions kept in the alphabet of Ben Sira portray Lilith's making from the identical earth that brought forth Adam. Unlike Eve, shaped from Adam's rib, Lilith came forth as his partner of equal standing, made at the same time rather than afterward. This creation happening together gave her standing that Eve would never hold. She had not been produced from masculine essence, but formed independently by divine hands. The struggle between Adam and Lilith emerged from questions concerning authority and submission. During intimate connections, Lilith turned down lying beneath Adam, demanding that their equal creation gave her right to equal partnership in every part of marriage. When Adam insisted on traditional submission, making appeal to conventional masculine authority, Lilith made a selection that would echo across thousands of years. She uttered the secret name of God and lifted into the air, leaving Eden forever. This action of rebellion needed supernatural understanding. By some means, Lilith had discovered divine names that held power to go beyond earthly limits. Her leaving was not simple running away, but aware spiritual uprising against assumed masculine superiority. Divine response to Lilith's escape shows the complexity of ancient views toward feminine independence. God dispatched 3 angels, Sinoi, Sansanoi, and Simanjalof, to bring back the wayward wife and bring order back to the first marriage. When they located her by the Red Sea, already joining with demons and bringing forth supernatural children, negotiation turned out to be impossible. Lilith turned down returning, taking punishment rather than submission. The angels placed a curse on her children, declaring that hundreds would pass away daily unless she consented to spare human children protected by their names. This agreement built continuing conflict between Lilith's demonic descendants and Adam's human family line, a supernatural Cold War that would shape generations to come. The theological meaning of Lilith's narrative puts fundamental beliefs in question concerning divine intention and feminine character. If God made Lilith as Adam's equal, then her rebellion against submission raises questions whether masculine dominance was divinely established or imposed by humans. Her awareness of sacred names indicates she held spiritual authority that posed a threat to established religious arrangement. Commentaries from medieval Jewish sources expanded Lilith's narrative, portraying her continuing influence in human matters. She turned into the Queen of Demons, governing supernatural territories that ran parallel to and opposed earthly kingdoms. Her servants included the spirits of night that delivered bad dreams, the shadows that made children afraid, and the tempters that directed righteous men off course. Christian traditions absorbed parts of Lilith's legend while changing her into a character of complete evil. She showed up in artwork from medieval times as a serpent woman who tempted Eve in Eden, making her responsible for humanity's fall. This interpretation moved focus from her rebellion against masculine authority to her corruption of feminine obedience. Islamic traditions keep similar narratives concerning jinn females who turned down human authority and set up independent supernatural societies. These beings held beauty and intelligence exceeding human capacity, yet used their gifts for rebellion rather than cooperation. Like Lilith, they stood for feminine power functioning outside masculine control. The psychological aspects of Lilith's legend show ancient consciousness of shadow parts inside feminine character. While Eve gave form to the idealized wife, made to balance masculine requirements, willing to receive guidance, naturally oriented toward nurturing, Lilith stood for the powerful woman who turned down traditional limits and asserted authority for herself. Scholars with feminist perspectives have reclaimed Lilith as a symbol of feminine independence and resistance to oppression by patriarchy. Her refusal to submit, her assertion of equality, her willingness to take punishment rather than settle represent qualities that women today admire and attempt to copy. She turns into the first feminist, the initial woman who selected freedom over security. Ancient writings portray continuing struggle between Lilith's supernatural children and the human descendants of Adam and Eve. This cosmic battle shaped how early peoples grasped natural catastrophes, sickness in childhood, and spiritual conflict. Lilith's legacy built a family line running parallel to the feminine that put in question and posed threats to the official genealogies traced through Eve's daughters. The connection between Lilith and the daughters without names born to Adam opens fascinating options. Did they hold awareness concerning their father's first wife? Did narratives concerning her move through the family, handed down across generations of women who grasped both her attraction and her danger? The daughters could have struggled with opposing models of femininity, Eve's submission against Lilith's rebellion. Proof discovered by archaeologists from cultures in the ancient Near East shows widespread worship of powerful feminine deities who held both creative and destructive abilities. Goddesses like Inanna, Astarte, and Kali showed how ancient peoples grasped feminine divinity as covering the complete range of power, including parts that later monotheistic traditions would categorize as demonic. Lilith's narrative addresses as well the question of where Cain discovered his wife after being sent away from his family. Certain traditions propose he married one of Lilith's daughters, building a mixed family line that brought together human and demonic characteristics. This union would account for the technological advancement and cultural complexity connected to Cain's descendants while explaining their spiritual corruption. The impact of Lilith's legend reaches well past its initial Jewish setting. Her identity shows up in grimoires and magical writings across medieval Europe. Artists from the Renaissance portrayed her as a beautiful yet dangerous temptress. Poets from the Romantic period honored her independence while issuing warnings concerning her destructive power. Psychology in modern times uses her identity for conditions involving feminine aggression and sexuality. Grasping Lilith's connection to the daughters of Adam and Eve calls for seeing her as their shadow sister, the feminine character who gave form to possibilities they could not follow. While the name daughters in writings, not in scripture, took on their positions as wives and mothers, Lilith stood for the path not followed, the rebellious option that stayed available yet dangerous. Her continuing presence in human awareness indicates something running deeper than simple folklore. Lilith gives form to parts of feminine experience that official religious stories could not hold: the wish for equality, the refusal to submit, the willingness to take exile rather than settle on essential dignity. The Silent Mothers, before dawn. Prior to dawn breaking over the first household, prior to roosters discovering how to call out or children finding laughter, the daughters of Adam and Eve were already conscious. They crushed grain between rocks, looked after fires that could not be permitted to go out, and spoke prayers in whispers to a God they had never laid eyes on, yet whose presence gave shape to every instant of their existence. Their day-to-day existence started before dawn broke. Collecting water meant traveling to the stream flowing on Eden's eastern side, a trek demanding vigilance, since untamed creatures still held memories of the time when humans were off-limits. The trail, smoothed by countless unshod footsteps, traced markers readable only to them: the gnarled olive with its twisted trunk, the stone resembling a bear in slumber, the open space where blossoms arranged themselves in formations that appeared almost intentional. Preparing food devoured hours that women today can scarcely fathom. Each individual seed demanded personal care, winnowed from husks by fingers trained to discern through sensation alone. Fresh produce required inspection for damage, organization by maturity level, and preservation using methods inherited from their mother, who had discovered through experimentation which approaches kept spoilage at bay. The daughters cultivated specialized expertise that would become vital for humanity's continuation. One gained mastery in recognizing safe vegetation, separating nutritious plants from toxic twins. Another perfected techniques for keeping food edible, learning which blends of salt, fire curing, and dehydration stopped harmful decomposition. A third studied creature patterns, grasping when wild beasts presented danger and when safe approach was possible. The connections they shared carried extraordinary closeness. Different from future generations of women raised among grandmothers, maternal aunts, and female cousins, these daughters possessed only one another for womanly fellowship. They forged attachments surpassing typical sisterhood, serving as each other's trusted allies, counselors, and dearest companions. Their exchanges followed rhythms contemporary women would likely understand. They traded insights, would lighting their parents' temperaments, wondered aloud about their brothers' romantic inclinations, and examined visions that occasionally felt predictive. Their hushed conversations during labor established the earliest feminine traditions, setting precedents that would shape how women would connect with each other across all time. Arranging marriages inside the original family demanded careful diplomacy. The daughters took active parts in these deliberations, voicing inclinations that their parents respected seriously despite the restricted choices on hand. Historical fragments indicate these exchanges displayed remarkable insight about partnership compatibility, reciprocal regard, and emotional bonds. The firstborn daughter, based on incomplete records, demonstrated inherent abilities to guide that her younger siblings acknowledged without bitterness. She coordinated domestic responsibilities, arbitrated conflicts among family members, and acted as intermediary between children and parents during periods of strain. Her influence stemmed not solely from sequence of birth, but from proven discernment and equity in managing household difficulties. Their labor reached past household upkeep into primitive technological advancement. Historical accounts attribute to women the discovery of controlled fermentation, the development of fabric-making methods, and the creation of initial therapeutic remedies from botanical and mineral sources. Adam's daughters almost certainly achieved comparable breakthroughs, testing natural resources to address urgent problems threatening familial continuity. The mental burden they shouldered escapes simple understanding. Every daughter recognized her choice in marriage would shape not merely individual contentment, but humanity's hereditary trajectory itself. The offspring she produced would constitute major fractions of Earth's total inhabitants. Her achievements or shortcomings as partner and parent could sway whether the complete species persisted or vanished. Their devotional practices evolved separately from their brothers' more structured religious demonstrations. As the men constructed platforms for offerings and presented animal gifts, the daughters invented personal worship habits that recognized divine existence in routine activities. They spoke blessings over dough before heating, expressed gratitude for surviving delivery, and voiced sacred melodies during work that linked ordinary chores with holy intention. The daughters additionally functioned as keepers of ancestral recollection. Prior to documentation systems, they committed lineages to memory, safeguarded narratives, and sustained spoken customs that would eventually become cornerstone religious writings. Their capacity to retrieve specifics precisely, to maintain linguistic subtleties, and to transmit accounts unchanged to their offspring transformed them into living archives of initial human reality. Their bond with their mother, Eve, held particular importance. During close discussions throughout joint tasks, Eve transferred, understanding acquired through her distinctive experiences in paradise. The daughters absorbed lessons about heavenly nearness, about temptation's character, about the repercussions of decisions in ways their brothers, concentrated on outward pursuits, might never completely comprehend. The dread that certainly troubled these earliest daughters barely permits imagination. They possessed no healing wisdom to direct them across pregnancy and delivery, no birth attendants to provide aid during challenging labors, no gathered knowledge about raising young to assist them through the obstacles of nurturing the initial generation born wholly beyond paradise's gates. Still, they endured, producing answers through resourcefulness and resolve. Evidence from primitive farming communities shows refined grasp of nutrition throughout gestation, approaches for handling problematic births, and systems for shielding newborns from illness and harm. The original daughters probably formulated comparable understanding through attentive watching and trial. Their unions with their brothers generated distinctive emotional circumstances. These weren't courtship bonds that built slowly between unknown persons, but close alliances between individuals who had experienced shared youth, household confidences, and reciprocal reliance for staying alive. The shift from family member to life partner necessitated mental modifications no earlier generation had ever undertaken. The daughters mastered balancing conflicting allegiances, to parents who had nurtured them, to spouses who were simultaneously siblings, to offspring who bore humanity's complete future inside their maturing characters. Historical writings hint at the emotional intricacy of these bonds through quick mentions of household disagreements, reconciliations, and persistent struggles of preserving unity inside the first multi-generational family. Their effect on their children's spiritual growth appears across early faith customs. The habit of mothers instructing children in prayer, the practice of women keeping domestic sacred spaces, the ritual of feminine benediction over meals and household matters. These configurations probably started with Adam's daughters, who fashioned the initial templates of home-centered spirituality. Adam's daughters in Islamic accounts. The Quranic heritage retains recollections of Adam's daughters with a tenderness that stands in sharp opposition to the severe quietness present in alternative holy books. Islamic references portray these early women not as unidentified phantoms, but as persons whose characters mold the actual bedrock of human society. Their narratives course through hadith writings like concealed currents bearing insight that formal chronicles frequently disregarded. Based on Islamic teachers, Adam and Hawa, that is Eve, received blessings of 40 offspring, 20 sets of twins, every pair holding one male child and one female child. This plentiful reproduction displayed heavenly compassion, guaranteeing humanity's persistence while supplying adequate hereditary variety to prevent difficulties linked with near-relation unions. The deliberate matching revealed God's planning in arranging for human perpetuation. The oldest daughter, recognized in Islamic heritage as Aklimia, held attractiveness that turned mythical among early Islamic interpreters. Her luminous presence mirrored the celestial image more distinctly than subsequent generations would bear, causing her to seem nearly angelic to those encountering her. This exceptional beauty, though, turned into both gift and weight, since it drew notice that would trouble family interactions. Cain's twin sister, named as Iklimat or Luluwa, varying by reference, showed mild insight that balanced her brother's farming capabilities. Islamic heritage portrays her trying to guide Cain as envy started devouring him, presenting perspectives about heavenly fairness and the necessity of embracing God's determination. Her peacemaking attempts, while finally fruitless, created frameworks of feminine arbitration that would affect later generations. The daughter matched with Abel, occasionally identified as Aklimia, exhibited her brother's spiritual receptiveness and commitment to veneration. Islamic references portray her as especially talented in comprehending heavenly indicators in environmental occurrences, the interpretation behind uncommon cloud shapes, the importance of creature conduct, the spiritual meanings of cyclical transformations. This instinctive perception made her a treasured advisor inside the household. Seth's intended companion, identified as Azura in certain Islamic writings, held nurturing drives that spread past her personal children to include the whole human household. She functioned as replacement mother to parentless young ones, physician to the ailing, and guide to those wrestling with spiritual inquiries. Her caring character assisted in founding the custom of feminine attention that would grow central to Islamic household framework. Islamic tradition confronts the religious complications of sibling unions with elaborate logic. Throughout the initial generations, while human numbers stayed limited and hereditary variety restricted, God allowed marriages that would subsequently be prohibited. These partnerships bore heavenly approval since they accomplished essential objectives: human continuation and the founding of virtuous lineages that would ultimately yield prophets and righteous societies. The Hadith writings maintain thorough portrayals of marriage rituals between Adam's offspring. These observances extended multiple days, including prayers, elaborate meals, and ceremonies that respected both the pairs and the heavenly design they were completing. The daughters underwent extensive preparations that recognized their critical positions in founding human households and societies. Historical Islamic interpreters portray how the daughters shaped their husbands' spiritual maturation via mild direction and thoughtful advice. They assisted their brothers in keeping attachment with heavenly instruction regardless of the hardships of existence beyond paradise. Their shaping worked through affection and esteem instead of outright command, establishing partnership models that would affect Islamic matrimonial principles across centuries. The daughters similarly assumed critical positions in maintaining religious understanding. Islamic heritage stresses the value of mothers in conveying faith to young ones. Indicating this framework started with Adam's daughters, who operated as the initial religious teachers. They retained prayers in memory, maintained accounts about Eden, and instructed their offspring the correct methods to honor and serve God. Certain Islamic references portray unique revelations granted straight to the daughters, heavenly exchanges that supplied direction for their exceptional positions as humanity's initial mothers and partners. These communications handled concrete worries about delivery, child nurturing, and household administration, while simultaneously supplying spiritual perspectives about women's bond with the celestial. The notion of feminine spiritual jurisdiction in early Islamic heritage varies considerably from subsequent male-dominated readings. Adam's daughters held unmediated access to heavenly counsel, the capability to decode spiritual indicators, and the obligation to convey religious understanding to coming generations. Their command originated from heavenly designation instead of human authorization. Islamic legal authorities have extensively argued the consequences of the initial marriages for modern family regulations. If God sanctioned sibling marriage at the start, what standards directed heavenly decision-making regarding family arrangement? The resolution seems to rest in situations and requirement, instead of fixed regulations. Proposing Islamic law ought to modify to shifting circumstances while preserving fundamental spiritual standards. The daughters' shaping of early human society gets comprehensive treatment in Islamic historical compositions. They receive recognition for cultivating domestic crafts, fashioning the initial woven materials, founding hospitality traditions, and arranging community festivities that reinforced social connections. Their additions to civilization matched or surpassed those of their more celebrated brothers. Historical Arabic verse maintains stanzas that could echo extremely early customs about Adam's daughters. These compositions portray women of remarkable attractiveness and perception who cherished intensely, endured considerably, and departed legacies that shaped all following generations. The poetic symbolism indicates spoken customs that came before Islamic documented references by hundreds of years. The designations assigned to the daughters in Islamic heritage bear religious meaning. Aklimia signifies intelligent or discerning, indicating her position as guardian of heavenly understanding. Luluwa renders as pearl, signaling value and innocence. Azura translates as assistant or backer, mirroring her purpose in founding virtuous bloodlines. These significant names stand opposite to the namelessness forced by alternative religious customs. Contemporary Islamic teachers have started re-evaluating these customs, considering present inquiries about gender fairness and feminine spiritual command. Adam's daughters supply historical examples for engaged feminine involvement in religious existence. Proposing women's spiritual guidance possesses heavenly sanction when situations demand it. The effect of these early customs reaches into present Islamic society via traditions that respect feminine perception, recognize mothers' positions in religious instruction, and acknowledge women's fundamental additions to household and community existence. Adam's daughters founded frameworks that persist in molding how Muslim households grasp gender positions and spiritual jurisdiction. Their accounts similarly supply reassurance to Muslim women confronting obstacles in male-controlled communities. The illustration of early daughters who held unmediated heavenly direction, who shaped their husbands' choices, and who molded the spiritual maturation of complete lineages, presents optimism that feminine perception can discover expression even inside conventional household arrangements. In Enochian tradition and the Watchers, far overhead, the productive lowlands where Adam's offspring minded herds and worked earth, heavenly creatures watched humanity with increasing interest. The Book of Enoch portrays these watchers as angels delegated to observe human progress, to guarantee heavenly regulations were honored, and to communicate back to paradise about the advancement of creation's most recent trial. Yet watching transformed into longing, and longing transformed into deeds that would permanently alter both celestial and earthly domains. The Watchers counted 200 based on Enochian heritage, and their commander Semyaza connected them jointly with pledges nobody could violate. They had watched human women from their heavenly observation position, observing their attractiveness, their elegance, their enigmatic capacity to generate fresh existence inside their forms. The attraction became overwhelming. Contrary to all heavenly instruction, the Watchers came down to claim partners from among the daughters of humanity. These daughters of humanity possess unique importance in the universal story that resulted. Historical references indicate they weren't arbitrary women selected by desirous angels, but particular persons whose ancestries reached back to Adam and Eve. The daughters of the initial household, presently distributed across the expanding human community, bore inside their inheritance the uncorrupted image of God that their founding parents had held in Eden. The Book of Enoch supplies designations for certain of the descended angels and portrays their specific domains of knowledge. Azazel instructed men in combat and armament creation. Kokabeel disclosed astronomy and star pattern arrangements. Barakil communicated understanding of cloud structures and atmospheric prediction. Yet, the writing proposes these angels similarly instructed their human partners mysteries of paradise that were intended to stay concealed from earthly comprehension. The partners of the Watchers obtained understanding that converted them from regular women into partially celestial creatures. They acquired knowledge to interpret the trajectories of heavenly bodies, to forecast what's ahead through heavenly indicators, to remedy ailments employing supernatural healing arts. This extraordinary instruction raised them beyond their entirely human counterparts, while generating friction with societies that perceived such understanding as threatening or sacrilegious. Evidence from historical Mesopotamian locations discloses refined astronomical understanding that appears to surpass what early farming communities ought to have commanded. Celestial maps, eclipse forecasts, and timing frameworks show computational exactness that proposes external instruction. The partners of the Watchers could have been the founding source of this progressive learning. The offspring produced from these partnerships bore hereditary traits that transcended regular human boundaries. Enochian heritage portrays giants whose stature achieved remarkable dimensions, whose power exceeded natural restrictions, whose hungers could not be fulfilled by regular methods. These Nephilim, as they grew recognized, constituted the initial generation of celestial-human combinations. Yet the concentration on gigantic descendants conceals similarly important female offspring. The daughters produced to Watcher fathers and human mothers received supernatural capacities that emerged distinctly from their brothers' bodily enormity. They held prophetic vision, extraordinary attractiveness, prolonged existence, spans, and perception that appeared to originate from heavenly sources instead of human acquisition. Historical writings suggest that these hybrid daughters turned into the establishers of secret faiths, the founding oracles who uttered predictions at consecrated locations, the perceptive women who operated as physicians and advisors in early societies. Their partially celestial character permitted them to operate as go-betweens across human and heavenly domains, converting heavenly communications into structures that regular individuals could grasp. The bond between unmixed human daughters traced from Adam and the hybrid daughters produced to Watchers generated intricate social patterns. Intermarriage across these categories yielded offspring who bore different blends of heavenly, angelic, and human traits. The hereditary blending that came from these partnerships molded human development in methods that exclusively natural advancement could not have accomplished. Islamic customs maintained corresponding accounts about jinn, who came down from unseen domains to partner with human women. These partnerships yielded offspring who held supernatural capacities yet stayed attached to earthly reality. Similar to the Enochian account, Islamic references indicate these blended marriages happened throughout humanity's beginning generations, when the divisions across distinct creation orders stayed more permeable. The religious consequences of these partnerships tested historical comprehension of heavenly purpose and universal arrangement. Had God intended for angels to come down and reproduce with humans? Was the blending of heavenly and earthly inheritance component of celestial planning or universal mishap? Various customs supply contradictory responses. Proposing historical societies wrestled with inquiries that contemporary religious scholars persist in arguing. The Watchers' partners confronted distinctive obstacles as they adjusted to their fresh, partially celestial condition. Their prolonged existences signified observing their entirely human kin mature and perish while they stayed vigorous. Their extraordinary understanding generated separation from societies that could not comprehend their perspectives. Their hybrid offspring demanded direction for capacities that no earlier generation had held. Enochian writings portray intricate municipalities constructed by the Nephilim beneath their father's direction, displaying construction and engineering that transcended regular human abilities. The mothers of these giant offspring certainly assumed critical positions in organizing and arranging these urban advancements, adding feminine perception about community arrangement, household structure, and social balance. The degradation that finally resulted in heavenly condemnation showed distinctly among male and female offspring of the Watchers. As the giant sons participated in brutality and domination that endangered human continuation, the daughters frequently chased understanding and authority in methods that tested heavenly command more quietly, yet similarly gravely. Historical writings portrayed institutions of extraordinary learning, where Watcher daughters instructed chosen human women progressive crafts that were intended to stay hidden. These secret traditions maintained understanding about healing, prediction, celestial observation, and heavenly enigmas that would subsequently shape different religious and mystical customs across human chronicles. The immense deluge functions as heavenly reaction to the degradation brought by Watcher reproduction with human women. Yet the condemnation focused chiefly on the hybrid giants, while displaying increased compassion toward their mothers and female relatives. Certain customs indicate specific daughters of Watchers endured the catastrophe via heavenly shielding, maintaining their extraordinary bloodlines in the world following the flood. Noah's household, selected to endure the deluge, could have contained women who bore Watcher inheritance in weakened structure. This likelihood would clarify how extraordinary understanding and capacities continued in human societies following the deluge regardless of heavenly efforts to purify the earth of degradation. The daughters supplied concealed persistence across pre-deluge and post-deluge societies. The shaping of Watcher daughters on human advancement reaches past their direct households into wider cultural and technological progress. Their extraordinary perspectives hastened human acquisition in celestial observation, computation, healing arts, and cultivation. What could have required hundreds of years to uncover via natural watching was compressed into several generations via heavenly instruction. Contemporary readers frequently concentrate on the harmful dimensions of the Watcher account, the uprising, the degradation, the heavenly condemnation that resulted. Yet historical audiences could have grasped the account distinctly, perceiving it as clarification for human capability that transcended regular boundaries. The daughters constituted the prospect that humanity could surpass its founding restrictions via heavenly favor or universal mishap. The Nephilim mothers. In the historical writings, an account reveals itself that alters everything we assumed we grasped about the daughters of the initial household. The Book of Enoch speaks of creatures who came down from heavenly domains. These Watchers, as they were designated, gazed upon the earth and perceived something that moved them past logic. The daughters of humanity traversed the earth in those times, attractive past earthly comprehension. Their locks captured daylight like spun precious metal. Their sounds bore tunes that caused the actual stones to weep with desire. Among these daughters existed the granddaughters and great-granddaughters of Eve herself. They bore in their blood the recollection of paradise, although they had never witnessed its gardens. When paradise encountered earth in prohibited partnership, the universe shuddered. These heavenly creatures selected earthly women as their associates. The daughters produced offspring dissimilar to any the world had witnessed. Giants traversed among regular individuals. Creatures of impossible power and dreadful attractiveness wandered the earth like animate tempests, yet this endowment arrived enclosed in anguish deeper than oceanic chasms. The mothers who bore these celestial offspring experienced in methods that resisted understanding. Their forms extended past human restrictions, skeletal structures groaning beneath the massive divinity developing inside them. Their consciousness contacted domains of understanding too immense for earthly grasp. They glimpsed the workings of creation itself, and the vision scorched their awareness like gazing into the sun. Azura's daughter, based on one custom, existed among the initial to produce such a child. The mass of bearing divinity inside her earthly structure nearly fractured her essence into pieces too minute to reconstruct. She spoke of visions where celestial bodies murmured mysteries that burned her recollection clean of everything additional. The child inside her shifted with force that fractured her ribs and departed bruises in the configuration of wings. Delivery continued for days that appeared to extend into weeks. Additional women assembled around her, yet none could present solace for suffering that existed on numerous dimensions of reality at once. When the child ultimately appeared, he was already double the magnitude of regular infants. His gaze contained starlight. His contact could deform metal. His initial cry fractured every clay container inside a mile. These mothers turned into passages across worlds, yet passages that compensated the cost in their personal flesh and rational stability. Their offspring received endowments that rendered them both favored and condemned past measurement. They could perceive through stone and flesh to the essence beneath. They grasped the speech of wind and flame, earthquake and tempest. Still, they could never completely fit into either paradise or earth. The daughters who endured these deliveries were permanently altered in methods that distinguished them from all additional women. They matured distinctly from their female relatives, occasionally seeming decades more youthful than their time periods. Alternative occasions bearing the mass of hundreds of years in countenances still young. Their gaze contained profundities that alarmed even their personal households. Certain obtained the capacity to perceive what's ahead, revealing like manuscripts across their interior sight. Alternative individuals could remedy wounds with contact that departed them exhausted for days subsequently. Historical writings indicate these mother-daughters established their personal, concealed societies in distant locations where regular individuals feared to journey. They exchanged understanding that had been murmured to them by their heavenly associates throughout extended nights of impossible closeness. Crafts of healing and prediction transferred across them like consecrated flames that could not be extinguished by regular methods. They turned into the initial perceptive women, although their perception arrived at an expense that would reverberate across generations beyond counting. Their offspring developed tall and powerful, yet frequently perished young, their earthly structures incapable to hold heavenly substance indefinitely. The mothers acquired to cherish intensely, while readying constantly for deprivation. Their accounts were regarded too threatening to maintain in complete specification. Writers who ventured to document them frequently discovered their manuscripts enigmatically harmed by morning illumination. Precipitation would eliminate specific sections while departing alternative portions intact. Fire would devour exclusively particular verses that held the most forceful mysteries, as if the universe itself schemed to prevent these narratives from distributing past those intended to receive them. Still, pieces persist, concealed in the borders of historical documents like compressed blossoms across pages of abandoned volumes, maintained in the spoken customs of distant mountain communities where ancient methods perish gradually. These portions speak of mothers who compensated the final expense for bringing divinity into the world of flesh and skeletal structure, blood and tears. The immense deluge and abandoned bloodlines. Water ascended to conceal the tallest mountains, consuming municipalities and woodlands similarly in its unrelenting progression. The immense restoration had started, eliminating the gathered transgressions and degradations of a world gone astray. Yet beneath the turbulence of that heavenly purification, inquiries persisted like drowning murmurs. Which bloodlines would endure? Which recollections would be eliminated permanently? The daughters of Adam's lineage confronted a selection that would establish the prospect of humanity itself. Noah's vessel bore exclusively 8 souls based on the acquainted narration that young ones acquire in religious institutions. Still, deeper customs indicate a more intricate reality that teachers have assembled from incomplete references. The partners aboard that container bore inside them the hereditary recollections of the initial household, focusing thousands of years of feminine perception into merely 3 women. Noah's partner, undesignated in most records, yet identified Naamah in specific customs, followed her ancestry back via the daughters who had been abandoned by Chronicle's official guardians. The bloodline of Azura coursed in her circulation like a subterranean waterway. The perception of Awan existed in her visions, emerging in instances of emergency when historical understanding was required most. She transported more than merely her personal existence onto that floating refuge. She bore the concentrated quintessence of innumerable generations. The deluge waters attempted to eliminate the contamination that had distributed across the earth like a spiritual disease. The Nephilim had reproduced past enumeration, their giant structures degrading the natural arrangement that maintained paradise and earth in appropriate equilibrium. Yet the daughters who had produced them were not malevolent in themselves. They were containers who had bore burdens too massive for earthly structures, relinquishing their personal tranquility for the perpetuation of heavenly bloodlines. Certain customs murmur that specific daughters escaped the deluge via alternative methods, employing understanding their heavenly associates had communicated throughout stolen instances of closeness. They withdrew into concealed caverns profound inside mountains that ascended beyond the water level like stone islands in a limitless ocean. These women maintained crafts and understanding that would alternatively have been forfeited permanently beneath the waves. The caverns they protected in turned into temporal containers, enclosed chambers where the antediluvian world persisted to exist in miniature. Here the daughters sustained the consecrated flames that attached earth to paradise. They cultivated gardens that developed by manufactured illumination, maintaining seeds from the founding creation. They nurtured offspring who would never witness the sun until the waters withdrew. The rainbow that materialized following the waters withdrew bore more than heavenly commitment of subsequent compassion. It transported the spectral reverberations of bloodlines that had somehow endured the immense elimination, refracted via prismatic illumination, similar to optimism rendered visible. The daughters' quintessence persisted in weakened yet persistent structures distributed across the spectrum of human prospect. Ham's partner, Shem's partner, Japheth's partner. These women, whose designations were consumed by time, bore forward the feminine perception of the antediluvian world, like torches in the obscurity. They recalled melodies that could pacify untamed creatures and soothe tempests. They grasped which plants could remedy wounds that ought to have been deadly, which minerals could cleanse water, which celestial bodies forecasted alterations in atmospheric conditions and cycles. The world following the deluge pretended to be pristine and fresh, eliminated pure of all earlier degradation. Yet the daughters' shaping penetrated via like subterranean springs that emerge in unexpected locations. Their endowments materialized in the hands and consciousness of women who possessed no deliberate recollection of historical instruction. A weaver would fashion formations of impossible intricacy without grasping why her fingers shifted in those specific sequences. A mother would voice lullabies that appeared to originate from nowhere, still bore the reverberations of Eden in their tunes. The hereditary inheritance of the initial daughters demonstrated too powerful to be thoroughly eliminated by deluge or time. It emerged in the prophetesses who would subsequently speak for heavenly sounds, Miriam, Deborah, Huldah. It showed in the perceptive women who operated as advisors to monarchs and arbitrators, presenting advice that appeared to originate from sources deeper than individual reality. The deluge had been intended to generate a pristine foundation for humanity's subsequent opportunity. Alternatively, it turned into a strainer that focused the most fundamental dimensions of the daughter's inheritance while eliminating the peripheral specifications. What endured was not their bodily structures or even their designations, yet something far more persistent, the indestructible quintessence of feminine perception and power that no quantity of water could weaken. Proto-history and legendary women across societies. Across the world, in territories where the designation of Adam was never uttered and the Hebrew speech never resounded, comparable accounts appeared from the shared unconscious of humanity. The initial mothers, the undesignated daughters, the women who shouldered the mass of commencing civilization while their designations dissolved into murmured legend and abandoned melody. In the Hindu customs that extend back into obscurities older than documented time, Aditi produced the deities themselves. She was identified the mother of formation, the infinite one from whom all reality coursed like waterways from a mountain origin. Still, her daughter's designations diminish into the intricacy of Sanskrit verses maintained in ceremony, yet missing from widespread comprehension. The correspondence reverberates like a remote bell across hundreds of years. Always the mother recalled for her fundamental position, the daughters abandoned regardless of their persisting shaping. The Norse spoke of Ask and Embla, the initial man and woman fashioned from ash and elm by deities who traversed among earthly beings in those historical times. Yet what of their daughters, who certainly must have resulted? The Voluspa suggests undesignated women who fashioned the destinies of deities and mortals, rotating fate on looms that existed past bodily reality. These daughters bore the identical burden as Eve's offspring, to produce a world while staying invisible to its recorders and chroniclers. Mayan formation accounts narrate of the hero twins and their ventures in the netherworld, their triumphs over mortality itself. Yet the writings similarly murmur of their female relatives, women who contained the schedule of time in their consciousness like animate repositories. They grasped the rotations that regulated precipitation and collection, delivery and mortality, the ascent and descent of societies. Their understanding molded the immense pyramids and the precise forecasts of eclipses. Still, their additions were credited to male religious leaders and celestial observers. In every society, the framework repeats with troubling regularity that proposes deeper realities about human character and social structure. The initial father obtains respect and recollection, his designation uttered in prayers and fashioned in stone monuments. The initial mother obtains acknowledgement for her position in commencing humanity, although frequently her authority is thoroughly limited and regulated. Yet the daughters who perpetuated that commencement drift into designationless obscurity, their additions absorbed into the accomplishments of their brothers and male offspring. This elimination was not coincidental or the outcome of arbitrary historical processes. It mirrored a universal apprehension about feminine authority in its rawest, most unregulated structure. Creation's daughters bore capacities that came before the regulations men would subsequently construct to hold and channel them. They existed too proximate to the origin, too near the heavenly spark that animated all reality. Egyptian documentation speaks of Isis and her mystical understanding, her capacity to revive the deceased and direct the forces of character, yet they similarly reference undesignated female relatives who distributed her authorities in differing degrees. These women could remedy with contact, communicate with the deceased, and perceive across immense distances. Their capacities endangered the appearing arrangement that positioned heavenly jurisdiction exclusively in masculine hands. The Celtic customs maintained more than most alternative societies, maybe since their territorial separation shielded them from external shaping for extended durations. Danu's daughters were recalled by designation: Brigid, Morrigan, Macha, and additional individuals. Still, even here, the acquainted framework ultimately asserted itself as Christianity distributed across Ireland like morning vapor. These daughter deities turned into either consecrated figures stripped of their founding authority or malevolent entities to be feared and prevented. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime accounts speak of the rainbow serpent and the initial ancestors who molded the territory via their travels. The daughters in these narratives sustained their authority longer than in most alternative customs, turning into the guardians of consecrated locations and the instructors of continuation perception that could signify the distinction across existence and mortality in severe environments. Geography and separation shielded their accounts when documented religion could not contact them with its standardizing shaping. The universality of these frameworks indicates something significant about human awareness and social maturation. Across landmasses and thousands of years, human communities acknowledged the authority of the founding daughters with notable regularity. Subsequently, with identical regularity, they selected to conceal that acknowledgement beneath layers of selective recollection and intentional abandoning. The inheritance of Azura and Awan, past the incomplete references in historical writings that address them as simple genealogical footnotes, we can reconstruct the existences of Adam and Eve's designated daughters via thorough notice to cultural frameworks, enduring folklore, and the reasoning of early human social structure. Azura and Awan were not simply biological requirements in the heavenly design. They were the designers of early human community, the constructors of civilization's bedrock. Azura, whose designation signifies brightness or radiant one in multiple historical languages, probably operated as the guardian of flame in the initial household. This position reached far past the straightforward responsibility of maintaining cooking flames or sustaining warmth throughout cold nights. She sustained the consecrated flame that attached earth to paradise, the perpetual fire that operated as humanity's initial temple and platform. Her responsibilities contained timing the cycles via thorough watching of heavenly trajectories, designating the passage of days with ceremony and ritual, and maintaining the recollection of heavenly encounters via spoken heritage and symbolic habit. She turned into humanity's initial celestial observer, although her discipline was inseparable from her devotion. Morning would discover Azura beyond the household structure, observing the horizon for indicators that directed daily existence and extended duration organization. She grasped which clouds transported precipitation and which transported exclusively empty commitment. She could interpret the conduct of birds and creatures to forecast alterations in atmospheric conditions and cycles. This understanding signified continuation for everyone who relied on her perception, rendering her essential to the expanding human society. Her union to her brother Cain was not simply practical requirement dictated by restricted community, yet universal necessity inscribed into the structure of formation itself. The bloodline required to sustain its innocence for multiple generations prior to adequate hereditary variety could safely enter via unions with the offspring of alternative partnerships. Azura bore this burden with elegance that turned mythical among their offspring. The writing indicates that Azura wrestled with the mass of her universal obligations. She grasped that her selections would influence not merely her personal offspring yet innumerable generations still unproduced. This understanding occasionally overwhelmed her with a perception of obligation that approached immobility. Still, she endured, directed by visions that displayed her the final intention of her relinquishments. The offspring she produced received her endowment for interpreting natural indicators and decoding heavenly determination via earthly occurrences. They turned into the initial atmospheric observers, the founding celestial observers who followed heavenly trajectories and constructed the bedrock for subsequent disciplines. Via Azura's ancestry arrived the understanding that would subsequently construct the immense observatories of Babylon and Egypt, the stone circles that designated cyclical alterations, the schedules that structured human time. Awan's account pursues a distinct trajectory, yet demonstrates similarly fundamental to human maturation. Her designation indicates longing, yearning, or profound affection, indicating her position as the guardian of emotional and relational perception inside the initial household. As Azura observed the atmospheres for heavenly communications, Awan observed the human essence for indicators of happiness and anguish, affection and disagreement. She cultivated the initial ceremonies around delivery and mortality, fashioning rituals that assisted the expanding household process, the significant shifts that designated the boundaries of earthly reality. When someone in the growing society readied to depart this world, Awan would remain with them via their concluding hours, presenting existence that facilitated the travel from existence to whatever rested past. Her grasp of human character permitted her to perceive beneath-surface emotions to the deeper currents that shifted individuals' essences. She acquired to acknowledge the indicators that came before mortality, not merely bodily symptoms, yet the spiritual readiness that souls experienced prior to liberation. This understanding rendered her both revered and moderately feared by alternative individuals, who could not grasp how she grasped things that appeared unknowable. The offspring Awan nurtured received her emotional receptiveness and interpersonal perception. They turned into the initial advisors, the founding arbitrators who resolved disagreements prior to brutality could fracture the delicate early societies. Via Awan's shaping, humanity acquired that disagreement could be addressed via comprehension, instead of force exclusively. That receiving was frequently more forceful than uttering. Both female relatives confronted obstacles that would have fractured essences less readied for experiencing. They existed via the trauma of their brother Abel's mortality at Cain's hand, an occurrence that fractured the initial household's innocence and presented them to anguish past imagination. They assisted their parents process culpability and anguish that possessed no historical example in human reality. They nurtured their personal offspring while recognizing that every selection they rendered would reverberate via innumerable generations. The writings indicate both women existed remarkably extended existences, even by the standards of their period when human lifespans extended across hundreds of years. Azura achieved nearly 800 years, her consciousness staying acute until the conclusion, as she persisted to instruct younger generations the crafts she had perfected. Awan existed to witness her great-great-grandchildren found the initial permanent communities, observing humanity's shift from nomadic wandering to agricultural constancy. Their mortalities designated the conclusion of a period in human awareness. With them perished the final unmediated attachment to the founding heavenly design for humanity, the concluding connection to the consciousness that had conceived formation itself. Their offspring and grand-offspring would bear forward pieces of their perception like distributed seeds. Yet the thorough comprehension these female relatives held would never be replicated in any solitary person. The grieving that resulted their mortalities continued for extended periods. Complete societies assembled to distribute recollections and maintain their instruction. Melodies were fashioned that tried to capture their quintessence. Accounts were refined and polished until they accomplished the condition of consecrated writing. Still, even these attempts could not completely hold the magnitude of what had been forfeited when these notable women returned to dust. Daughters of transgression, daughters of rescue. The ancient thinkers found themselves wrestling with how to classify the daughters of that first family, seeking the kind of tidy categorization that would later become the hallmark of systematic theology. The question haunted them: were these women blessed, or were they cursed? Were they pure, or had they been corrupted? Were they innocent casualties of forces entirely beyond their grasp, or were they active collaborators in humanity's ongoing descent from divine favor? This struggle to understand them birthed a dualistic framework that would go on to define religious thinking for thousands of years to come. The splitting of all womankind into two fundamental categories, reducing boundless complexity into something far more manageable and containable. On one side of this divide stood what were called the daughters of transgression, women believed to carry Eve's original sin within their very marrow, like an inherited curse impossible to wash away. Each breath they took served as a reminder to the world of humanity's expulsion from paradise. Their physical beauty was viewed as perilous because it evoked the serpent's powers of seduction, that same temptation which had resulted in the loss of Eden. Their mental capacity was regarded with suspicion because it mirrored their mother's deadly inquisitiveness. The ancient writings portrayed these daughters as having inherited their mother's nature of questioning, in ways that left their fathers profoundly uneasy. They would ask why certain rules existed in the form they did. They would venture beyond the limits that had been established for their protection and for the community's continued stability. Their mere presence represented a challenge to the developing notion that women ought to stay confined within designated roles that restricted their impact on matters of cosmic significance. These daughters bore the blame for every catastrophe that struck their communities. Failed harvests, waves of sickness, fatal accidents, all of these were laid at the feet of their supposedly corrupting influence. They existed under perpetual scrutiny, watched constantly for any indication of that rebellious nature supposedly coursing through their family lines like poison contaminating a water source. On the opposite side arose what became known as the Daughters of Redemption, women perceived as Eve restored through suffering and through surrender to the divine purpose. These women earned praise for embracing their designated positions without protest or resistance. They brought children into the world through agony, serving as willing penitents for their mother's fateful decision, converting affliction into benediction through steadfast endurance. They functioned as carriers for the continuation of the divine design while suppressing their own longings and aspirations. But this binary division was always an artificial framework, imposed by minds uncomfortable with complexity, minds that preferred straightforward categories over subtle comprehension. The actual daughters of Adam and Eve possessed far greater depth than either category could encompass or faithfully represent. They held both defiance and faithfulness within the same hearts. They possessed both hazardous knowledge and restorative wisdom, at times manifesting in identical deeds. Archaeological findings from the ancient Near Eastern regions indicate that early civilizations actually celebrated these complexities rather than recoiling from them. Female sculptures from that era depict women in postures of command and strength that stand in opposition to later presumptions about primitive gender dynamics. They grasp symbols representing both generation and annihilation, existence and cessation, understanding and enigma. They appear as whole entities rather than partial ideals. The daughters mastered the art of moving between these contradictory expectations, developing abilities that would be transmitted through countless generations of women who followed. They cultivated what could be described as a split awareness, the capacity to project submission and obedience while preserving their inner sovereignty and carrying forward their vital work. This capability would become essential for endurance in societies growing increasingly patriarchal in structure. Some daughters selected entirely different trajectories, turning away from both prescribed identities in favor of options their communities could scarcely grasp. Ancient lore speaks of women who departed from human civilization completely, selecting isolation over accommodation. They became recluses in wilderness territories, forming bonds with animal companions who comprehended them more deeply than their own kin ever managed to. These unconventional daughters were frequently reimagined later as deities of untamed regions and wild nature. Diana, Artemis, and comparable figures might have their roots in cultural recollections of Adam's daughters, who prioritized liberty over belonging, autonomy over protection. Their narratives underwent sanitization and mythologization across time, yet the essential truth endured. Certain women simply refused to be classified or dominated. The binary framework persisted because it fulfilled the requirements of societies learning to structure themselves along hierarchical lines, with transparent chains of authority and specified positions for each person. Multifaceted personalities proved harder to regulate than simplified archetypes that could be managed through social enforcement and religious teaching. The daughters' authentic natures posed a threat to this developing structure with their unpredictability and their access to sources of power existing outside human organizations. Nevertheless, their impact kept surfacing in surprising ways throughout the span of history. The witchcraft traditions of medieval European societies bore traces of their botanical expertise and spiritual customs. The mystical dimensions of diverse religious movements retained pieces of their revelations concerning the fundamental nature of existence. The daughters persisted in concealed manifestations that could not be wholly eliminated, regardless of how exhaustively official culture attempted to eradicate them. The ancient, divine feminine. Before the veneration of one singular deity achieved supremacy over human awareness and restructured spiritual reality around masculine power, the world pulsed with feminine divinity flowing through each facet of being. The daughters of Adam and Eve matured during this transitional period when the goddess still moved among mortal beings, though her authority was starting to diminish under pressure from emerging forms of religious structure. These earliest daughters retained within their consciousness the resonance of divine femininity that had molded the universe before patriarchal frameworks imposed their particular vision of cosmic arrangement. Their grandmother figures, those archetypal mothers of existence who lived before human family trees commenced, continued to appear to them in dreams and revelatory experiences that connected mortal and divine consciousness. The understanding these meetings imparted would subsequently be prohibited and forced into hiding. But during those initial days, it circulated freely between celestial and earthly realms. The goddess manifested to the daughters in numerous forms, each appearance conveying distinct dimensions of divine feminine insight. At times, she arrived as the Great Mother who had given birth to the stars themselves from her universal womb, nourishing entire galaxies with milk that formed the Milky Way. On other occasions, she revealed herself as the sage elder who grasped the profoundest secrets of existence and mortality, bearing knowledge that existed before the formation of mortal realms. Most strikingly, she presented herself as the everlasting maiden who embodied limitless potential and unrestrained creative energy. This manifestation of the goddess provoked terror in subsequent patriarchal faiths because it defied containment within marriage or childbearing. It stood for feminine authority that existed for its own purpose rather than in servitude to masculine requirements or divine masculine power. Azura absorbed from the goddess the skill of interpreting the sacred configurations written into natural occurrences, like text inscribed in a tongue more ancient than spoken language. Every formation of clouds, every pattern of bird flight, every placement of stones transmitted messages for those blessed with the vision to perceive beyond superficial appearances. This understanding rendered her invaluable to the expanding human settlement, though it also isolated her in ways that occasionally brought solitude. Awan obtained different endowments from her divine meetings. Her wisdom concentrated more heavily on restoration and emotional renewal. The goddess instructed her in the sacred melodies that could mend fractured bones and repair devastated spirits, tunes that operated on frequencies more profound than audible sound. She discovered which expressions, articulated in the appropriate order with the proper intention, could summon rainfall during periods of drought or halt bleeding that risked draining life completely away. The remaining unnamed daughters each obtained their individual share of ancient feminine understanding, allocated according to their distinct characters and the community's diverse requirements. One mastered the craft of foresight, perceiving the strands of possibility extending into what lay ahead, like an enormous web linking all conceivable outcomes. Another perfected the capacity to converse with the essences of those who had crossed beyond the barrier of death, functioning as a bridge between realms. This allocation of divine endowments fulfilled a function beyond individual enhancement or community assistance. The goddess was making preparations for her own gradual retreat from direct participation in human matters. Understanding that humanity required the development of self-reliance while still preserving connection to divine wisdom, she needed to guarantee that her knowledge would endure even when her presence grew less concrete and more mysterious. The daughters established the first schools of mysteries in answer to this divine instruction. In concealed groves and hidden caverns distant from the expanding settlements, they transmitted their understanding to other women who demonstrated the appropriate receptivity and commitment. These schools functioned in absolute secrecy, because even during those beginning days, men were starting to fear the authority these women wielded and the independence it signified. The goddess traditions highlighted completeness in manners that subsequent religions would find difficult to grasp or embrace. Life and death were perceived as collaborators rather than adversaries locked in perpetual struggle. Creation and destruction moved together in timeless harmony, each essential for the persistence of universal equilibrium. The daughters absorbed how to welcome all dimensions of existence without condemnation or apprehension. Grasping that wholeness demanded accepting both illumination and darkness. As patriarchal frameworks hardened around them, like cement solidifying around fragile blossoms, the goddess withdrew more deeply into obscured locations where her sway could persist without direct confrontation. But she did not desert the daughters completely or abandon them without defense against transformations they could not forestall. She instructed them in the art of camouflaging their activities as innocent domestic pursuits that would trigger no alarm. Food preparation became a variation of transformation, with formulas that bore spiritual meaning beyond simple sustenance. Creating textiles incorporated defensive enchantments into each strand, fashioning clothing that operated as protection against spiritual assault. Tending plants became connection with earth spirits, a custom that sustained attachment to divine feminine force through the nurturing of vegetation bearing healing and magical characteristics. The daughters safeguarded this understanding by concealing it within narratives, melodies, and customary handicrafts that seemed harmless to superficial examination. What appeared to be mere amusement or domestic knowledge actually held multiple levels of spiritual guidance that could be interpreted by those possessing the correct comprehension and initiation. The invisible lineage through Seth to Noah. The family records that endure in documented form convey only a portion of the account of human progression from the initial family to the catastrophic deluge. Between every recorded father and son, daughters came into being, who transmitted the core of their heritage in ways that numerical lists and designations could never capture or sufficiently express. From Seth's descendants to Noah's household, these invisible women molded history from the margins, while obtaining no acknowledgement for their accomplishments. Seth's daughters received their grandfather Adam's talent for naming things, but their employment of this gift assumed forms that varied dramatically from his methodology. Where Adam had designated the animals and vegetation of Eden based on their fundamental characters, these women created names for the sentiments and connections that would shape human society for all following ages. They invented the initial expressions for affection in its numerous manifestations, sorrow in its multiple phases, optimism that continued despite situations, and empathy that connected differences between persons. Their linguistic breakthroughs extended beyond simple word creation. They formulated the emotional structure that permitted humans to articulate intricate internal conditions. the relational framework that enabled profound exchange between individuals. Without their achievements, human civilization would have remained frozen at the tier of elementary survival, rather than developing the abundant interpersonal bonds that distinguish genuine culture. Enosh's daughters originated the earliest manifestations of veneration that progressed beyond elementary thankfulness toward refined spiritual activity. They comprehended that the divine presence demanded invitation rather than insistence, that prayer represented dialogue rather than supplication. Their ceremonies incorporated modest contributions: bread, wine, blossoms positioned in configurations that created portals between dimensions. But the purposes underlying these gestures were deep and meticulously contemplated. These women produced the initial sacred timetables, designating days and periods based on spiritual importance rather than simple functional necessity. They founded holy occasions when the collective would assemble for restoration and contemplation. Their innovations in spiritual custom would subsequently shape every significant faith tradition, though their achievements would be credited to male visionaries and clergy members. Throughout the successive generations of Canaan, Mahalalel, and Jared, the daughters sustained their function as keepers of understanding and cultural guardians. They committed to memory the accounts that clarified how existence functioned, preserving spoken archives within their consciousness when inscription had not yet been created. They protected the songs that held the designations of celestial bodies and the characteristics of therapeutic vegetation, the ancestry records that followed both physical and spiritual inheritance. Their techniques for remembrance were advanced beyond contemporary comprehension. They could retrieve thousands upon thousands of accounts with flawless precision, modifying their deliveries to suit their audiences without sacrificing critical particulars. They grasped that memory was not inactive storage but dynamic formation, that each recitation infused fresh vitality into timeless verities. The daughters of Enoch confronted distinctive obstacles that distinguished them from all other women in the bloodline. Their father moved alongside divine entities and ultimately vanished from the earth completely, transferred to heavenly domains without undergoing mortality. These women received his mystical capabilities, but needed to discover how to exist with visions that occasionally overpowered their everyday consciousness and rendered ordinary existence challenging to preserve. They formulated advanced approaches for controlling supernatural occurrences without forfeiting their rationality or their attachment to earthly obligations. Contemplative customs that anchored their awareness in physical actuality when visions risked transporting them elsewhere. Respiratory practices that prevented them from becoming lost in visionary conditions for hazardous durations. These abilities would later shape the meditative traditions of numerous faiths. Methuselah's daughters existed through more generations than any other women in human chronicle, observing transformations that would ordinarily demand numerous lifetimes to witness. They watched the world shift from a location where divine and mortal beings routinely interacted to one where such meetings grew progressively uncommon and questionable. Their remarkably extended lives transformed them into repositories of understanding spanning centuries of human advancement. These ancient women operated as connections between distinct epochs of human consciousness and social structure. They retained recollections of the beginning days when exchange with animals was ordinary and instinctive. They survived to observe the emergence of agriculture and the initial enduring cities. Their viewpoints encompassed alterations that supplied them with distinctive perspectives into the rhythms of human advancement and deterioration. Lamech's daughters confronted the intensifying darkness that would shortly require the flood's purifying verdict. They perceived their reality growing progressively violent and debased. They observed as the endowments bestowed to previous generations became perverted into mechanisms of suppression and devastation. Yet they persisted in their labor of conservation, somehow recognizing that restoration would arrive through catastrophe rather than incremental improvement. The wives who boarded Noah's vessel bore within themselves the distilled quintessence of all these overlooked lineages, the assembled wisdom of centuries of invisible women. They represented the culmination of generations of knowledge preservation, the ultimate harvest of a tradition that had been developing since the initial days following Eden. Myth, memory, and elimination. The vanishing of the daughters from documented history was not a coincidence of temporal passage or the arbitrary deterioration of ancient texts disintegrating in abandoned repositories. It constituted a calculated initiative of elimination that developed across centuries, propelled by powers that grasped the essential authority of regulating narrative and deciding which accounts future generations would receive. The earliest narrators were frequently women who possessed innate talents for recollection and theatrical delivery. Mothers transmitted tales to their offspring during extended winter evenings when darkness rendered other pursuits impractical. Grandmothers distributed wisdom through accounts that embedded functional knowledge within memorable adventures and engaging personalities. These spoken traditions maintained the daughters' identities and actions with exceptional precision across multiple generations. The women who operated as keepers of stories formulated refined approaches for guaranteeing faithful transmission. They employed rhythm and repetition to render information simpler to retain. They positioned critical particulars within emotionally charged scenes that would adhere in listeners' consciousness. They fashioned multiple variations of each narrative, permitting cross-verification when recollection wavered or particulars became muddled. But as systems of writing emerged and literacy became linked with religious and political authority, the regulation of documented narrative transferred to male scribes who labored within organizations that had already determined which accounts merited conservation. These men functioned according to priorities that contrasted sharply with those of the oral tradition preservers. The scribes operated within religious and political frameworks that regarded the daughters' narratives as potentially destabilizing to developing social structures. These tales held examples of feminine power and self-determination that opposed newer convictions about inherent hierarchy and divine instruction. They conserved knowledge of women's spiritual talents that menaced the increasing monopolization of religious authority by male priesthoods. The mechanism of elimination was incremental and outwardly harmless, accomplished through thousands of minor editorial choices rather than spectacular acts of suppression. A scribe would elect to condense a genealogy, referencing only the male designations for the purpose of conciseness and parchment economization. A priest would concentrate his teaching on the instruction provided by identified patriarchs, while minimizing the women who had facilitated their accomplishments and rendered their wisdom attainable. Transcription mistakes were permitted to remain uncorrected when they removed references to women's pursuits or achievements. Conversions between languages supplied occasions to streamline intricate passages by extracting feminine components that appeared less significant to male translators. Library classifications neglected to cross-reference texts that held women's accounts, rendering them effectively invisible to subsequent investigators. Across time, these minor omissions gathered into enormous chasms in the historical documentation that generated a deceptive impression of early human civilization. What had previously been a balanced narrative of human beginnings transformed into an account told almost wholly from masculine viewpoints. The daughters were edited into non-existence through 1,000 minuscule selections made by individuals who might not have deliberately planned such thorough elimination. The elimination fulfilled particular functions beyond simple gender discrimination or unconscious predisposition. The daughters' narratives held knowledge that endangered developing power structures in tangible ways. They recalled when religious authority was distributed between genders rather than monopolized by male hierarchies. They conserved traditions of feminine guidance that opposed newer beliefs about divine instruction and inherent arrangement. Their tales also contained functional information that certain groups desired to monopolize for economic and political benefit. Restorative knowledge, agricultural understanding, and spiritual customs that had been openly distributed were progressively limited to specific castes or occupational classes. Forgetting the daughters simplified, claiming exclusive possession of their findings and innovations. The physical annihilation of texts hastened the mechanism of elimination, while supplying concealment for intentional removal of uncomfortable materials. Repository fires devoured scrolls that held the daughters' accounts, frequently igniting in areas where women's texts were housed. Religious reformers commanded the incineration of volumes they considered heretical or antiquated, employing theological rationalizations to remove historical documentation. Military conflicts dispersed and demolished archives that might have conserved alternative interpretations of early chronicle. But memory demonstrated greater resilience than those seeking to regulate it had anticipated or arranged for. The daughters' narratives endured in camouflaged manifestations that could not be readily detected or removed. Children's tales conserved their adventures under altered identities and in modified settings. Traditional remedies transmitted their restorative knowledge in functional applications. Customary songs sustained their spiritual customs in encoded verses that resembled simple amusement. The very continuation of these concealed survivals exposes the insufficiency of the elimination initiative and the authority of feminine wisdom to discover new manifestations of expression. Regardless of how exhaustively the official documentation was purged, the daughters' sway kept emerging in manifestations that could not be entirely suppressed by institutional power. Women throughout historical progression seemed to instinctively identify echoes of their personal experiences in these ancient tales, even when they possessed no deliberate knowledge of the original sources. They transmitted fragments of accounts they had never officially encountered. They enacted traditions they could not clarify the origins of. They safeguarded what scribes and priests had attempted to eradicate, maintaining alive recollections that declined to perish. Rediscovering the First Sisters, the contemporary world has commenced excavating the concealed accounts of Adam and Eve's daughters with instruments and viewpoints that the ancient eliminators never foresaw or prepared for. Feminist academics approach ancient texts with inquiries that expose previously invisible configurations and presumptions. Archaeological findings supply documentation that contests traditional understandings and creates new pathways for comprehension. Computer examination of ancient manuscripts has disclosed layers of modification that were invisible to earlier investigators working with restricted technology and conventional approaches. Locations where text was intentionally obscured or modified become evident under spectral visualization that can identify alterations in ink composition and parchment preparation. These methodologies have revealed references to daughters that had been meticulously extracted from official iterations through sophisticated modification processes. The Dead Sea Scrolls supplied some of the most substantial rediscoveries when they surfaced from caverns that had conserved them for nearly 2,000 years. Among the portions discovered in those desert concealment locations were sections of texts that identified daughters who had been eliminated from canonical scripture. These glimpses provided enticing documentation of more abundant traditions that had been suppressed by subsequent editors. Contemporary Jewish scholarship has welcomed the assignment of reconstructing the daughters' accounts through creative interpretation that occupies gaps left by incomplete historical documentation. These recent understandings envision the personalities, relationships, and accomplishments of women who existed only as genetic necessities in the original texts. They restore self-determination and intricacy to figures who had been diminished to simple biological functions in male-centered narratives. Scholars such as Rabbi Jill Hammer and Rachel Adler have pioneered methodologies that regard the biblical text as an initial point rather than a concluding authority. They inquire what accounts might have existed before the modification process commenced. They scrutinize the intervals between verses for documentation of eliminated material. They contemplate what functions the elimination might have fulfilled and what verities it might have been constructed to conceal. Christian feminist theology has adopted a distinct but comparably significant methodology to recovering the daughter's importance. These academics concentrate on the theological ramifications of the daughter's elimination, questioning what spiritual verities were forfeited when feminine viewpoints were extracted from creation narratives. Their labor exposes how the absence of the daughters impoverished religious comprehension and restricted spiritual progression. Theologians Ove Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and Rosemary Radford Ruther have established how the systematic exclusion of women's expressions from sacred texts generated incomplete and distorted representations of divine intention and human function. Their investigation demonstrates that recovering the daughter's accounts is not simply an academic pursuit, but a spiritual requirement for communities pursuing wholeness. Islamic traditions have conserved more particulars about the early daughters than other Abrahamic faiths, perhaps because their spoken transmission approaches demonstrated greater resistance to systematic modification. Contemporary Muslim women scholars are utilizing these sources to generate fuller representations of feminine positions in early human history that contest modern presumptions about Islamic gender dynamics. Scholars such as Amina Wadud and Asma Barlas have demonstrated how meticulous attention to Quranic language discloses documentation of women's spiritual authority that was subsequently obscured by patriarchal understanding. Their investigation reveals functional wisdom about family connections, community guidance, and spiritual progression that remains applicable to contemporary existence. Archaeological documentation supports numerous of these reconstructive initiatives, supplying physical confirmation for theories about women's positions in ancient civilizations. Excavations throughout the ancient Near Eastern regions have revealed documentation of women's central positions in early agricultural progression, religious custom, and community guidance. These discoveries indicate that the daughter's significance was intentionally minimized rather than organically forgotten. Recent findings at locations such as Çatalhöyük in Turkey disclose civilizations where women occupied positions of religious authority and social guidance that oppose traditional presumptions about ancient gender dynamics. These archaeological revelations supply context for comprehending how the daughters of Adam and Eve might have operated in their own settlements. Modern genetic investigation has contributed another dimension to the daughter's rediscovery that connects science and spirituality. Examinations of mitochondrial DNA disclose that all humans descend from a relatively limited group of ancient mothers who existed in Africa tens of thousands of years previously. This mitochondrial Eve and her daughters transform into more than mythical figures. They signify actual women whose genetic material still circulates through every person living today. This genetic documentation supplies a scientific foundation for the spiritual revelation that all humans are literally connected through common female ancestors. The daughters of Adam and Eve, whether historical or mythical, signify this universal feminine heritage that links all people across racial, cultural, and religious boundaries. Artists and authors have welcomed the daughters as subjects for creative investigation that transcends academic examination. Novels such as The Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd and The Red Tent by Anita Diamant envision the daily existences and internal conflicts of biblical women, bestowing them voices and personalities that traditional texts refuse them. Contemporary painters portray the daughters as intricate individuals rather than symbolic figures, displaying them engaged in pursuits that establish intelligence, creativity, and spiritual authority. These artistic understandings assist modern audiences in connecting emotionally with women who had been diminished to annotations in genealogical listings. Poetry has demonstrated particularly effective for bestowing voice to sentiments and reflections that were never documented in ancient texts. Poets such as Lynn Ungar and Jan Richardson have generated verses that articulate from the daughters' viewpoints, envisioning their reactions to the dramatic occurrences they observed and the impossible selections they confronted. The digital era has democratized the mechanism of rediscovery in manners that would have been impossible for individual scholars laboring in isolation. Online communities distribute investigation and theories about the daughters' accounts, generating collaborative initiatives that encompass continents and academic disciplines. Social media platforms permit global dialogues about feminist theology and ancient women's chronicle. Wikipedia entries, academic repositories, and specialized digital sites have rendered previously obscure investigation accessible to general audiences. This democratization has quickened the velocity of discovery and understanding, generating a feedback cycle where popular interest propels academic investigation and scholarly discoveries shape creative productions. The rediscovery mechanism confronts resistance from traditional religious and academic establishments that have invested centuries in sustaining particular understandings of ancient texts. But the momentum has grown too powerful to reverse. Each recent discovery constructs upon previous labor, generating an expanding foundation of knowledge about the daughters' positions and significance, dust, and names. Ultimately, all accounts return to the earth that bestowed them existence, cycling through endless metamorphoses that link past to present to what lies ahead. The daughters of Adam and Eve, whether identified or anonymous, recalled or overlooked, have transformed into part of the dust from which new accounts continue to surface. Like blossoms pushing through fractures in concrete, their physical manifestations dissolved long previously into component elements that now exist in every portion of the natural realm. The calcium from their skeletal structures strengthens the shells of creatures in remote oceans. The carbon from their flesh nourishes trees and forests they never witnessed. The iron from their blood circulates in the veins of people who have never encountered their names, but bear their essence regardless. Yet something beyond simple chemical elements endures their physical dissolution. Their names might have been surrendered to wind and temporal passage, dispersed like seeds on infertile ground, but their essence continues in every woman who declines to be silenced by authority that requires her surrender. It exists in every mother who instructs her daughter to interrogate the world surrounding her with bravery and understanding. It flourishes in every grandmother who transmits wisdom that was never inscribed in any volume, but demonstrates more valuable than published knowledge. The dust that contains their remains has journeyed the world through mechanisms that reflect their spiritual sway. Transported by winds across continents, combined with precipitation that irrigates distant fields, dispersed through erosion that reshapes terrain according to configurations more ancient than human civilization. In a genuinely literal sense, the daughters have become integrated into everything that exists on Earth, incorporated into the planetary system they assisted to populate. This physical distribution mirrors their spiritual sway in manners that indicate deeper verities about consciousness and connection. Portions of their wisdom materialize in traditions that never heard their names articulated aloud. Their bravery resonates in the deeds of women who never absorbed their accounts but somehow received their resolve. Their affection for truth emerges in unexpected locations where falsehoods have maintained dominance for centuries. Positioned at the boundary of our contemporary comprehension, observing back across millennia of human progression, we can perceive how the configuration of elimination persists to function in contemporary civilizations. Women's achievements to science, art, and social advancement still confront systematic minimization by organizations that prefer to acknowledge male leaders. The daughters' experience remains tragically applicable because the powers that eliminated them have transformed but not vanished. Yet, something fundamental has transformed in humanity's capacity to conserve and recognize diverse voices and viewpoints. The instruments now exist to preserve and convey accounts that would have been forfeited in earlier epochs. Digital archives resist the varieties of selective annihilation that claimed ancient manuscripts. Global exchange networks prevent the isolation that once rendered elimination possible and relatively simple to accomplish. The daughters instructed us through their absence that names are not demanded for existence to possess meaning or sway. Their anonymous impact molded civilization as powerfully as any identified patriarch, whose actions were carved in stone monuments. They established that being overlooked by official chronicle does not reduce the reality of an existence well lived or the worth of achievements made with affection rather than ambition for acknowledgement. In tranquil moments when wind travels through arid locations where dust swirls in configurations that seem almost purposeful, some claim you can still detect whispers of their voices, not articulating their own names. Those are vanished beyond retrieval, forfeited in the silence between heartbeats. Instead, they summon the names of their daughters and their daughters' daughters and all the women who proceeded after them in continuous succession. The most significant monument to the daughters of Adam and Eve is not carved in stone or inscribed in volumes that accumulate dust in overlooked repositories. It exists in the persisting strength of women who confront elimination with dignity preserved, who conserve knowledge despite opposition from those who apprehend its ramifications, who love intensely even when that affection is not documented or recalled by official chroniclers. Their account concludes where it originated, in the interval between breath and silence, between memory and forgetting, between the dust of the earth and the vastness of sky that contains infinite possibilities. They exist in that timeless moment where potential transforms into reality, where the unnamed asserts its entitlement to exist, where affection inscribes itself across the universe in characters too expansive for any solitary account to encompass, but compact enough to fit in every human heart. The daughters of the first family have transformed into the daughters of every family through spiritual inheritance that surpasses genetic connection. Their legacy is not conservation but metamorphosis, not memory but ongoing formation. They instruct us that being overlooked is not identical to being vanished, That sway can continue without acknowledgement. That truth possesses methods of enduring that outlast the frameworks constructed to contain it. In the dust and names, in the named and nameless, in the recalled and overlooked, their account persists without conclusion. It waits in every woman who has ever pondered her own origin and function. It summons to every daughter who has ever interrogated her position in the world or contested expectations imposed upon her. It assures that no account is ever genuinely forfeited as long as there are hearts courageous enough to envision what might have been and hands willing to inscribe what might yet be.